The queen gave the signal for the army to move into position. Her commanders split the forces into swift desert riders, heavy infantry, and archers who would take the high dunes. The young man rode at her side, scanning the enemy lines. The siege. Towers moved slowly, their great wheels sinking into the sand. The armored riders were faster, but their formation was tight and predictable. He could see the weaknesses in their advance like cracks in stone. The first clash came when the queen's riders swept down from the dunes, striking the enemy flank. Sand exploded under the hooves of the desert steeds as blades flashed in the early light. The young man rode straight into the fight, his curved sword cutting through the armor of the first rider who tried to block him. The queen fought only a few paces away, her strikes fast and precise. Together they cut a path through the chaos. Arrows rained down from the dunes, forcing the enemy to break formation. The heavy infantry of the queen's army moved in, shields locked, driving the enemy riders back toward the traps the young man had described in the war hall. The sand beneath the enemy's siege machines began to shift. One by one, the massive towers tilted and sank, their crews scrambling to escape. A roar of victory rose from the queen's soldiers as they pressed forward. The young man fought with a focus that shut out everything but the battle before him. He blocked a strike aimed at the queen, turning his blade to counter before the attacker could recover. She met his eyes briefly, a flicker of respect passing between them, even in the heart of the fight. It was not the moment to speak, but they both knew what it meant. His promise was no longer just words. It was action. The enemy commander rode into the center of the battle, his black armor glinting in the sun. His voice carried above the noise, rallying his troops. The queen turned her steed toward him without hesitation, but the young man urged his horse forward first. The clash between them was fierce, metal striking metal with sharp bursts of sound. The enemy commander was strong, but the young man's movements were faster and sharper. With a final strike, he forced the commander from his saddle. The fall of their leader broke the enemy's will. The riders began to retreat, scattering across the sands. The queen's army pushed them farther until the battlefield was theirs. The sound of clashing steel gave way to the calls of victory and the gathering of the wounded. The young man dismounted, his armor dented and his blade stained. The queen approached him, her expression unreadable until she spoke. She told him he had fought as one of her own. Her voice carried so the soldiers around them could hear. The words sparked murmurs among the troops, many of whom now looked at him with newfound respect. He bowed his head but said nothing, letting the moment speak for itself. In his chest, his heartbeat slowed, but the fire of the promise still burned. This battle had been only one part of it. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The queen ordered her army to return to the capital with the wounded and the captured enemy weapons. She rode beside the young man in silence, both of them watching the desert stretch out endlessly ahead. The wind carried the scent of dust and victory, but also the unspoken weight of what would come next. Neither of them believed the court would simply accept what had happened. As the city's towers came into view, the queen looked at him and said the time had come to decide if the promise made years ago would truly be fulfilled. He met her gaze and told her he was ready for whatever answer she would give. The palace gates opened as the army returned, their banners lifted high. Citizens gathered along the streets, cheering for their queen and her soldiers. The young man rode beside her, his armor scratched and marked from the battle. The ring still rested in his pocket, untouched since the day he had arrived. Now with the war behind them, he knew there would be no more delays. The moment to face her answer had come. Inside the throne chamber, the court was already assembled. Nobles in rich robes stood in neat lines, their faces a mix of curiosity and caution. The queen entered first, her crown gleaming under the high light of the hall. The young man followed a step behind, the sound of their footsteps echoing across the polished floor. All eyes turned toward them as they reached the center of the room. The queen addressed the court with a voice both calm and firm. She spoke of the battle they had just fought and the bravery of the soldiers who had stood against the enemy. Then she spoke of the human who had fought at her side, who had saved her life in the heat of combat, and who had kept a promise that had begun years before. Her words silenced the room completely. She turned to face him. In her hand, she held the small wooden box he had given her on the day of his arrival. She opened it before the court, revealing the ring inside. The golden light of the chamber reflected off its simple metal surface. She asked him, before all who listened, if he still wished to give this gift, knowing the weight it carried. His answer was steady. He said yes. The queen looked over the gathered nobles, her gaze sharp enough to cut through their whispers. She told them that strength was not found in bloodlines alone, but in loyalty, courage, and truth. She declared that a promise kept through hardship was worth more than any alliance formed by fear. Then, with her own hand, she took the ring and placed it upon her finger. A murmur spread through the court, some voices raised in protest, others speaking in awe. The queen lifted her hand, silencing them all. She said her choice was final and would not be questioned. She spoke of the bond formed between them, not of rank or title, but of trust. The young man bowed deeply, though his eyes never left hers. In that moment, the years of distance between boy and queen were gone. The court slowly knelt, one row after another, in acknowledgement of her decision. The queen stepped down from the dais and stood beside him. She told the court that the empire would face new trials, but it would face them with unity. She declared that the man who stood at her side had earned his place through deeds, not birth. Her words rang against the high walls like a bell calling for change. Later, when the court was dismissed, they walked together through the quiet palace gardens. The air was cool, and the night sky spread above them, full of stars. The queen stopped near a fountain, its water shining in the moonlight. She asked him if he had ever doubted she would accept the promise. He said he had never doubted her, only himself. She smiled at that, the same way she had smiled when he was a boy. She told him that on the day they first met, she had thought his words were nothing more than the bold dream of a child. But over the years she had found herself remembering them, more often than she expected. Now, with the ring on her finger, she knew it had been more than a dream. It had been the beginning of something she would not let go. The queen's words carried weight, but they also carried danger. If the court learned she spoke so highly of a human, the whispers would grow into storms. She knew her council already doubted her choices in matters far less personal. A promise between a queen and an outsider could become a weapon in the hands of her enemies. Still, she did not take back what she had said. The young man's presence challenged the rules that had stood for generations. Outside the private chamber, the court was restless. News had already begun to spread among the nobles. Some claimed the human had used tricks to win the queen's attention. Others said he was a symbol of the empire's openness. The truth was less simple. He was a man who had crossed deserts to keep his word, and that truth made some admire him while others feared the change he represented. The queen called for her most trusted advisor, a tall silver-haired alien who had served her family for decades. When the advisor entered, his eyes lingered on the young man for a moment before turning to the queen. She told him to speak honestly about what he saw. The advisor said the human's courage was clear, but so was the danger of letting him remain close. He warned that loyalty of the court could fracture under such strain. The young man listened without anger. He said he had not come to break her empire, but to honor her. He spoke plainly, without titles or false words. The advisor studied him again and asked why he thought a ruler should accept a bond that might weaken her rule. The young man answered, that strength was not only measured in armies and laws, but in the will to stand beside those you trust, no matter the cost. The queen's gaze shifted between them. She knew the advisor's words came from loyalty, yet the young man's came from a place even deeper. There was no ambition in his voice, no hunger for power, only the promise he had carried through every trial. She dismissed the advisor with a quiet command, knowing his counsel would be needed again. For now, she wanted no other voice between her and the man before her. She walked to the table and picked up the ring once more. Holding it in her palm, she asked if he understood what would be required of him if she accepted it. He said he did. His life would no longer be his own. Every action would reflect on her name, every mistake would be judged as hers as well. He told her he was ready to bear that weight if it meant keeping his place at her side. The queen moved to stand before him. Her golden eyes searched his face for any sign of doubt. She found none. In his eyes, she saw the same boy who had spoken to her without fear years ago. She saw the same unshaken courage, but now tempered by years of hardship. Slowly, she closed her fingers around the ring and let it rest in her grip. The silence between them felt like a decision forming. Outside, the sound of horns cut through the air. The queen turned her head toward the window. From the palace walls, the banners of gold and cream fluttered against the sudden rise of wind. A messenger entered, bowing quickly before speaking. An enemy force had been sighted moving toward the edge of the desert, their numbers unknown but their banners clear. The queen's calm expression hardened at once. She looked back at the young man and said the empire might soon face a war. If his promise was true, this would be the time to prove it. The young man straightened, his voice steady as he swore he would stand with her against whatever came. Asterisk. The queen wasted no time after hearing the messenger's warning. She ordered the council to assemble in the war hall and sent runners to alert the city garrison. The palace shifted from quiet tension to swift, controlled movement. Servants hurried through corridors carrying maps, armor, and sealed messages. The young man followed the queen, his steps matching hers. He could feel the change in her presence, from ruler of peace to commander of war. Inside the war hall, a massive table displayed a sand map of the desert and the surrounding territories. Colored stones marked troop positions and possible enemy routes. Generals in polished armor stood ready, their expressions grim. The queen listened as they explained the threat. The enemy force was larger than expected, with siege machines and fast riders that could reach the capital within days. The situation left little time for hesitation. One general suggested pulling back forces to defend the palace, while sending riders to slow the enemy's advance. Another argued for striking first before the enemy could set camp near the city walls. The queen listened to every word, her eyes steady on the map. The young man stayed silent until she looked at him directly and asked for his thoughts. The room fell quiet. Few outsiders had ever spoken in this hall, let alone a human. He stepped forward and studied the map. His voice was calm when he spoke. He told them the desert could be an ally if they used it wisely. He described routes where shifting sands could trap heavy machines, and narrow canyons where small units could strike and vanish before the enemy could respond. His ideas were simple but sharp. The generals exchanged glances, some doubtful, others quietly impressed. The queen nodded and ordered 2 generals to test his suggested positions. She then declared that she herself would lead the defense. This stirred a ripple through the room, but none dared oppose her openly. She turned to the young man and told him he would ride with her at the head of the vanguard. His presence would not only test his promise, but show the court the truth of his words. Preparations began at once. The palace armory rang with the sound of metal as soldiers checked weapons and armor. The young man was given a suit of light desert armor, built for speed and endurance. He adjusted the straps and fastenings until it felt like part of his own skin. In his hand, he carried a curved blade forged from the same ship metal as the ring he had made for her. As night fell, the queen stood with her army outside the city gates. Torches burned in long lines, casting light over faces hardened by battle. She mounted her tall desert steed, its scaled hide shimmering under the firelight. The young man mounted beside her, their eyes meeting briefly. No words were spoken, but the meaning was clear. This was the moment where a promise would meet its trial. The march began under the twin moons, their pale light guiding the army across the sands. The cold night air bit at their skin, but the rhythm of marching feet kept them warm. Scouts rode ahead, returning with signals of enemy movement. The queen moved with the confidence of someone born for such nights. The young man matched her pace, his senses sharp, every muscle ready for what lay ahead. By dawn, the enemy banners were visible in the distance. Lines of armored riders and siege towers darkened the horizon. The queen raised her hand, signaling the army to halt. She studied the sight for a long moment before turning to her commanders. Orders were given quickly, the plan taking shape like a blade being drawn. The young man tightened his grip on his sword. This would be the day he proved that his promise was more than words. The young man's answer came without pause. He said a promise was not broken by time, only by choice. He told her that the years had not erased his words, and the deserts had not dried the meaning behind them. The ring in his pocket was proof of that. The court murmured at his boldness, but no one interrupted. His eyes stayed locked on hers, steady and unshaken. The queen rose from her throne with slow grace. Her golden crown caught the light with every step she took toward him. She stopped only a short distance away, close enough that he could see the fine details of her jeweled armor. Her gaze moved over him, measuring his stance, the calluses on his hands, the scars that marked his arms. These were not the marks of a boy who had lived in safety. They were the proof of a life fought for. She asked him how many years it had been since that day. He told her the exact number, his voice calm but firm. The queen tilted her head slightly, as if weighing the truth of his memory. Around them, the nobles whispered again. Many of them had been present on that day long ago. They remembered the boy's courage and the queen's rare smile. Some wondered if she would honor such a strange vow. Others dismissed it as a passing amusement. The young man reached into his cloak and withdrew the small wooden box. Its surface was scratched from travel, but the lock still held. With careful hands, he opened it to reveal the ring. The metal gleamed faintly in the chamber's light, shaped in a simple but perfect circle. It was no jewel from the royal mines, but it carried the weight of his journey and the promise that had driven him across the sands. The queen did not take the ring immediately. Instead, she studied it in silence, her expression unreadable. She asked if he knew what giving such a gift to her truly meant. The young man said he understood. It was not just a ring, it was a request to cross the distance between worlds, between bloodlines, between the highest crown and the humblest sand dweller. He knew the risk of rejection, but he was not afraid of it. A long silence stretched between them. The sound of the desert wind outside seemed louder than the breathing of everyone in the chamber. Finally, the queen reached out her hand and lifted the ring from the box. Her fingers turned it slowly, catching the light. The young man's heartbeat thundered in his ears, but his face stayed calm. Whatever her answer would be, he had kept his word and placed the choice in her hands. The queen's eyes met his again. She said he had grown into a man who could stand without fear in the court of an empire. She said the deserts had shaped him, but his heart had stayed true. In her voice, there was no mockery, no disbelief, only respect. Then she turned to the court and asked them if they remembered the boy who had once stood here and made her laugh. Heads nodded, voices murmured, and even the guards' stances softened. She held the ring for a moment, longer before slipping it into her palm. She told the young man that promises had power, but so did the courage to keep them. The court waited for her final words, their eyes moving between them like an unspoken question. The queen took a step closer, her presence filling the space between them. Her next words carried clearly through the hall, touching every ear that listened. She said the story between them was not finished yet. Asterisk. The court reacted instantly to the queen's words. Some faces showed surprise, others quiet disapproval. A few nobles whispered to each other, their eyes sharp with suspicion. They saw the young man as an outsider, someone unworthy to stand so close to their ruler. But the queen's authority was absolute, and none dared to speak against her openly. The air in the chamber felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The young man stood firm under the weight of so many eyes. His gaze never left the queen. He could feel the tension rising like heat from the desert floor. The ring she held was small, yet in that moment it carried the power to shift the course of many lives. He knew the road ahead would not be simple. This was not the end of his journey. It was only the first door he had managed to open. The queen stepped back toward her throne, the long train of her robe whispering across the polished floor. She gestured for him to follow. The guards hesitated, unsure if they should allow it, but a single glance from her silenced their doubts. Together they walked through a set of carved doors that led to a private chamber. The murmurs of the court faded behind them until only the sound of their footsteps remained. Inside, the chamber was quieter, lined with silk curtains and lit by the soft glow of hanging lanterns. A low table stood in the center, bearing maps of distant territories and scrolls written in an alien script. The queen moved to the table and rested the ring upon it. She turned to face him, her expression more open than before. Without the eyes of the court upon her, she seemed less like an untouchable ruler and more like a woman studying a question she had not yet answered. She asked him what he had endured to return here. He told her of the storms that swallowed whole caravans, of the battles fought to protect his people, of the long nights when he wondered if she would even remember his face. His voice did not carry pride, only truth. He said that each trial had only made the promise stronger. The queen listened without interrupting, her gaze never leaving his. When he finished, she picked up the ring again. She turned it slowly between her fingers, as if the metal itself might tell her the story. Then she asked him why he had chosen to keep such a promise when it would have been easier to forget. The young man's answer was simple. He said that when he was a boy, her smile had shown him something worth crossing any desert for. It had been more than beauty. It had been hope. Her eyes softened, but only for a moment. She placed the ring back on the table and walked toward the window. Beyond it, the desert stretched endlessly under the twin suns. She spoke of the duties of her crown, the alliances that bound her, and the weight of the empire she carried on her shoulders. To bind herself to a human, she said, would shake the foundation of her world. Yet her voice carried no rejection, only the weight of truth. The young man stepped closer, stopping just behind her. He said he did not seek to take her throne or her power. He only sought to stand beside her, to be a shield when storms came, to walk the same path she walked. His words were not rehearsed. They came from the place where his promise had been born. For a long moment, the queen did not move. Then she turned to look at him fully. She told him his courage was greater than most who wore crowns. The desert sun burned like a golden fire over the royal camp, where banners of cream and gold swayed in the warm wind. People moved between tall silk tents, carrying water, weapons, and goods, but one scene stood apart. A young boy, barely tall, enough to reach the queen's waist, stood before her with eyes full of courage. His clothes were worn, his sandals dusty, yet he didn't look afraid. The alien queen, crowned in gold and dressed in white silk armor, smiled down at him as if he had said something she could never forget. Her guards watched with confusion as the boy's small voice carried across the quiet space. He had made a promise, bold and innocent, but it was enough to make the queen cover her mouth to hide her laughter. It wasn't mockery. It was something else, something softer. Her golden eyes studied him as if he was more than a child. Around them, the desert air seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if she would dismiss him or remember his words forever. The boy had come from the human settlements far beyond the sand seas. No human had spoken so directly to her before. In the alien court, humans were visitors at best, workers at worst, never equal to royalty. Yet here was this small human daring to speak of marriage, as if the gap between their worlds could be crossed by simple words. The queen leaned forward, her jewelry glittering in the sunlight, and asked him if he truly meant it. His answer was quick, without hesitation. He said he would grow tall and strong, and when that day came, he would return to give her a ring. A few nearby courtiers chuckled, but they quickly fell silent when the queen raised her hand. She told him to keep that promise, though her voice held a strange tone, half playful, half serious. Then she turned away, swept into the business of ruling an empire, while the boy's words echoed in the hot wind. Years passed. The desert court changed, wars came and went, and the boy's village saw both hardship and hope. But the queen never forgot the strange human child who had spoken to her as though the galaxy's rules meant nothing. Sometimes during long councils, she would find herself remembering his steady eyes. She wondered if he would ever return, though she told herself it was only curiosity, not hope. Still, when the desert winds blew, she thought of that moment. Far from the palace, the boy had grown into a young man. His hands were no longer soft but calloused from work and battle. He had learned to fight, to survive, and to lead. Yet one thing remained untouched by time, the promise he had made. In the quiet of night, under the same stars that shone over the queen's palace, he remembered her smile. He had no wealth, no titles, but he carried a single goal in his heart like a shield. One morning, as the twin suns rose over the horizon, he set out across the sands. His pack carried little food, a flask of water, and a small box made of carved wood. Inside was the ring he had crafted himself, shaped from metal taken from a fallen starship. Every step toward the palace felt heavier than the last, not because of the sand but because of the question burning in his mind. Would she remember him at all? The desert stretched for days, its dunes like golden oceans. He faced storms that cut his skin, nights where the cold bit deep, and days where the heat blurred the sky. Yet he did not turn back. Each mile brought him closer to the place where he had once stood as a boy before a queen, and each mile made his heart beat faster. Somewhere ahead, beyond the banners and the guards, the answer to his promise waited. The palace gate stood tall, carved from white stone and inlaid with gold. Guards in gleaming armor watched every movement with sharp eyes. The young man approached. Slowly, his footsteps sinking into the fine sand of the courtyard. His cloak, once clean, was now dusted from days of travel. The ring was hidden deep in his pocket, but the weight of it pressed against him as if it knew where he was going. The guards crossed their spears in front of him, blocking his path. Their language was not his, but he understood enough to know they were asking for his purpose. He stood tall and gave his name. He told them he had once met their queen when he was a boy, and that he had returned to fulfill a promise. The guards exchanged looks, unsure if they should laugh or call for someone higher in command. After a long pause, one of them left to fetch a court official. The man who arrived was dressed in flowing gold and cream robes, his expression cool and unreadable. He studied the young man from head to toe. The official asked why a human from the outer sands thought he could speak to the queen. The young man answered without fear. He said he was here to return what he had promised years ago. The official's lips twitched as though he found the claim amusing. Yet instead of sending him away, he signaled for the guards to let him pass. The young man was led through the gates, into the cool shade of the palace corridors. Marble floors reflected the sunlight pouring through carved arches. Strange music echoed faintly from deeper within the halls. Every step forward seemed to take him further from the dusty world outside. The palace was alive with movement. Servants carried trays of golden fruit and pitchers of sweet-smelling water. Soldiers in polished armor marched in perfect lines across the courtyards. Alien nobles dressed in shimmering silks spoke in low voices as they passed, yet no one stopped to greet the young man. He felt like a shadow drifting through a place of light, unnoticed by all but the guards at his back. At last, they entered the great throne chamber. It was a vast space with towering pillars wrapped in banners of cream and gold. A soft wind carried the scent of desert flowers through open windows. At the far end sat the queen, her golden crown catching the light. She was exactly as he remembered, though the years had deepened her presence. Her eyes, the color of molten gold, fixed on him the moment he entered. The guards stopped a few paces away and lowered their heads. The young man stepped forward alone. His heart pounded, but his steps did not falter. The queen leaned slightly forward on her throne, her expression unreadable. She asked in her soft yet commanding voice who he was and why he had come. The sound of her voice felt like the desert wind before a storm. He bowed deeply before answering. He told her his name and reminded her of the day he had stood before her as a boy. He repeated the words he had spoken then, the same words that had made her smile. He said he had returned as a man, with the strength and the courage to keep his promise. His hand slipped into his cloak and closed around the small wooden box. The moment felt as heavy as the sky before rain. The queen's lips curved slightly, though her eyes held a searching look. She asked if he truly thought such a promise still mattered after all this time. Her voice carried neither mockery nor rejection. It was as if she was testing the weight of his words. The court around them had grown silent, every noble and guard listening closely. The young man took a deep breath before giving his answer.